Part 1. In the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943, the German High Command looked at the American army in North Africa and saw amateurs. They had reasons. At a mountain pass called Kasserine in central Tunisia, in the middle of February, an entire American corps had come apart in the space of a few days. 5,000 men lost, nearly half of them taken prisoner. 183 tanks destroyed, 208 guns overrun, 500 jeeps and trucks abandoned in the Second Corps still existed on paper. In the field, it was a scared crowd holding a line in southern Tunisia and hoping the Germans would not come at it again soon. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, 50 years old, the Desert Fox himself, had punched through that line and gone home to Germany, believing he had confirmed what he already thought. The Americans could not fight, that the Americans would fold. That when the war in Europe came, and it was coming, the British would have to do the real work. Rommel would fly out of Africa for the last time on the 9th of March, 1943. He would leave the theater to a man named Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, 54 years old, a Prussian aristocrat who inherited both Rommel's command and Rommel's contempt for the American soldier. Above them, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, 57, ran the whole Mediterranean theater for Germany. Kesselring wanted the Americans pushed off the eastern dorsals. He believed it would be quick. He was about to meet one American general whose name the Germans would learn to fear more than any other Allied commander of the war. His name was George Smith Patton Jr. He was 57 years old. He had been born on the 11th of November, 1885, in San Gabriel, California. His family had been American soldiers going back 4 generations. His grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy. His father had been a district attorney. George had grown up around cavalry saddles and Civil War stories and books about Julius Caesar. He had gone to West Point, class of 1909. He had ridden in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finished 5th. He had commanded America's 1st tank unit in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, taken a bullet through the thigh at the age of 32, and never entirely stopped bleeding in his mind for the rest of his life. He believed in reincarnation. He believed he had been a Roman legionnaire under Julius Caesar. He believed he had died on the walls of Troy and again at Waterloo. He wrote his own poems and read them aloud to his staff. He carried a pair of ivory-handled revolvers. And in the 24 years between the end of the last war and the beginning of this one, he had spent almost every one of them almost invisible. A small army peacetime cavalry officer, passed over, watched by younger men, kept on active duty in the 1930s, largely because Dwight Eisenhower and a small circle of officers who understood what tanks were going to become had spoken up for him. Now he was 57, and he had been given a corps that had just been broken. On the 6th of March, 1943, George Patton took command of 2nd Corps in Tunisia. He did not start with tactics, he started with neckties. The mess halls closed at 7:30 in the morning, and they stayed closed. Helmets had to be worn with the chin strap fastened, leggings had to be worn in the desert heat. Every soldier caught out of uniform paid a $25 fine, $25 for a private. That was almost half a month's pay. The men hated him for it. They said so. Bradley heard them saying it. Bradley, Major General Omar Bradley, 50 years old, quiet Missourian, teacher's face, a man who did not raise his voice, had been sent down by Eisenhower to serve as Patton's deputy at 2nd Corps. He watched Patton walk the perimeter in his polished boots, his ivory revolvers on his hips, his voice loud, and he understood what nobody else in the Corps understood yet. Bradley understood that every time an American soldier had to knot his necktie in the desert, that soldier was being reminded that the days before Kasserine were over. The Germans did not notice any of this. Von Arnim inherited Rommel's opinion, Kesselring wanted movement, and the German 10th Panzer Division was given a job. 6,000 men, around 50 operational tanks, self-propelled guns, a line of anti-tank artillery. Their job was to come down the road east of a place called El Guettar, cross a broad valley of open ground, and push the Americans back. They believed it would be over in an afternoon. Patton had been there 10 days. The 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Delamesa Allen was already in position. On Patton's orders, and Bradley's, Squit's, and Allen's, the engineers of the 1st had laid a dense minefield across the mouth of the valley. Then the tank destroyer battalions, 4 of them, had dug in on the reverse slope of a low ridge called Kidab. Reverse slope. That means the German tanks in the valley looking up could not see them. The artillery had registered their guns on the open ground. Every square kilometer of that valley had a firing solution already written on a note tacked next to a howitzer. The trap was set before the 1st German tank rolled forward. A second American failure inside of 5 weeks would have ended the American army as an independent force in the Mediterranean force. Eisenhower would have been recalled. the British would have taken over strategic direction of the Western War. Every officer standing on that ridge that morning knew it. At 6 in the morning on the 23rd of March, 1943, the 10th Panzer came down the valley in formation. They rolled toward the minefield. They stopped. They dismounted engineers to clear the mines. That pause, that single pause, was the entire battle. The tank destroyers came up over the crest of Guettar Ridge. They fired, they dropped back below the crest before the German guns could find them. They came up again 100 yards to the left. They fired, they dropped back, and while the tanks in the valley twisted trying to find them, American artillery, all of it, came down on the German armor that no longer had anywhere to go. In about 1 hour, close to 30 German tanks were burning in that valley. One panzer destroyed every 2 minutes. That afternoon, the Germans came back. This time with infantry leading. The American guns cut them apart with air-bursting shells and with rounds that skipped off the hard desert ground and detonated at chest height in the middle of a walking line of men. Patton, watching from the top of the ridge, told an aide that it was a crime to kill infantry that good. By the next morning, the 10th Panzer retorted 26 operational tanks left. Half of its armored strength had been destroyed in a single day. The Americans had paid a price. One tank destroyer battalion had lost 21 of its vehicles and 72 of its men. Total American casualties for the engagement ran to around 500, but for the first time in the war, a veteran German Panzer Division had attacked American soldiers in open ground and had been broken by men that 17 days before nobody believed could hold a road. And the shape of the thing was already there. The preparation completed before anyone gave the order. The speed beyond what the enemy believed possible. The blow landing at the exact place the enemy had already decided no blow could reach. That was the first move. 4 months later, on an island in the Mediterranean, the same man would make it again. Bigger, faster, and in violation of a direct order from the British. Part 2 on the 10th of July, 1943, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Allied forces began landing on the southern beaches of Sicily. The operation was called Husky. The 8th Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, 55 years old, careful, cold, methodical, the man who had beaten Rommel at El Alamein, had been given the direct route up the east coast of Sicily. His objective was Messina, the port city on the northeast tip of the island, the gateway to the Italian mainland, the place from which the German army, if it was going to survive, would have to escape across the strait to Italy. Patton's 7th Army came in on the southern coast. His job was to protect Montgomery's flank. That is a technical phrase, and it means nothing. But what it meant in practice on the map was this. Montgomery was going to win the campaign. Patton was going to guard the western door, while Montgomery walked through the eastern one. On the 13th of July, 3 days after the landings, General Sir Harold Alexander, 51 years old, the British officer commanding 15th Army Group, and therefore both armies, went further. He moved the inter-army boundary west. He took Highway 124, the last good northern road available to the Americans, and gave it to the British. The Americans were now not just guarding the flank. They were being pushed against the western coast of Sicily. They were going nowhere. Bradley brought the order to Patton's tent. He said he could not accept it. Patton did not argue the order on paper. On the 17th of July, he flew to Tunis. He walked into Alexander's headquarters. He asked, in the politest possible language of a career American officer speaking to a very senior British general, for permission to conduct what he called a reconnaissance in force to the west. Alexander heard the phrase reconnaissance in force. He heard a patrol. Patton meant an army. He walked out of that headquarters and he built a provisional corps around the 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Infantry Division, and the 82nd. He gave it to his deputy, Major General Jeffrey Keyes, 55. Dependable, steady, a man who had been at Patton's side since Morocco. And he sent it west. The corps moved on the 19th of July. By the time Alexander in Tunis understood what was actually happening on his map and radioed forward that Patton was to halt, Patton's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, 40T9, reported back that the signal was garbled. Please repeat the message. Kept requesting repeats. According to Gay's own memoirs after the war, he kept requesting repeats until Palermo fell, which happened on the 22nd of July, 1943. The second largest city on the island of Sicily, the historic capital, the Provisional Corps had covered around 100 miles, roughly 160 kilometers, in 4 days. They had taken 19,000 prisoners. Alexander looked at the map. Palermo was in American hands. There was nothing to argue about anymore, but Patton was not finished. Because Messina, the actual prize, was still on the northeast coast of the island, still at the end of Montgomery's road. Between Palermo and Messina, along the northern shore of Sicily, ran the coastal highway 113. It ran under the Kasserine Mountains, which dropped straight down to the sea in one ridge after another. Every ridge is a natural fortress. Every ridge was held by the rear guard of the German 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, blowing the coast road behind them as they went. Frontal attacks would take weeks. The Germans had counted on frontal attacks. Patton did not attack frontally. He put infantry battalions on landing craft and he dropped them behind the German line. Amphibious hops leapfrog by sea, each battalion cutting the coast road behind the German rear guard while the main body pressed from the front. First amphibious hop went in on the 8th of August near a place called Sant'Agata. It shook out roughly 1,000 German prisoners. The second hop was the important one. Commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, Major General Lucian Truscott, 48, gravel-voiced, a professional who had come up through the horse cavalry, wanted to postpone. He said the landing at a place called Brolo was too risky. His men were exhausted. The German coastal artillery was still active. He wanted a day. Patton, according to accounts that Truscott himself confirmed after the war, asked him if he was afraid to fight. Truscott said that if Patton doubted him, Patton was welcome to give the division to somebody else. The landing went in. On the 11th of August, 1943, 650 men under Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard, 39 years old, an infantry officer from New York, landed behind the German positions at Brolo. They climbed Monte Cipolla and cut Highway 113. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division turned around and came back to kill them. Bernard's radio report from the top of that hill as the counterattack came in was 4 words. Enemy counterattacking fiercely. Do something. Of the 650 men on that hill, 177 were casualties in a single day. More than a quarter 7. Of the 8 guns they had landed with were destroyed on the beach. But the road stayed cut long enough and the German coastal position collapsed. 6 days later, at 4:30 in the morning, on the 17th of August, an American patrol walked into the outskirts of Messina. Patton had won the race by a matter of hours, and then the stink. In 38 days of fighting, the 7th Army had taken close to 9,000 casualties, roughly 235 men a day, killed, wounded, and missing. Almost all of them from Truscott's 3rd Division and from the Provisional Corps that had raced to Palermo. And across a strait less than 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest in 14 days of nightly ferry operations that neither the Royal Navy nor the American Navy managed to stop, the Germans had lifted almost 40,000 of their own troops off the island. More than 9,000 vehicles, 47 tanks, most of their artillery. The Italians had lifted 60,000 more. Patton had taken Sicily. He had not taken the German army on Sicily. The men Patton and Montgomery had been racing to trap. The men who had killed 9,000 American soldiers to by that time walked onto ferries and stepped off in Italy and formed up again on the mainland. They would be waiting at Salerno, at Anzio, on the Gustav Line, in every hill above, every road, all the way to the Alps. The race for Messina had been won. The bag had been left open. The second move was on the books. 16 months later, on the 16th of December, 1944, more than 200,000 German soldiers and close to 1,000 German tanks came out of the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and went straight through the thinnest sector of the American line. Their objective was the Meuse River, and after the Meuse, Antwerp split the Allied armies in half, end the war in the west. Within 3 days, at a road junction called Bastogne, 7 roads crossed. The 101st Airborne Division was inside that town. Around it, the Germans closed a ring. The entire operation depended on one assumption. The snow and the fog would keep Allied aircraft on the ground. The roads would be sheets of ice. German staff officers had calculated that no Allied army could disengage from the fighting. It was already in and turn 90 degrees and cover the ground fast enough to change anything. The calculation was correct. It was just carried out about the wrong man. Because on the 18th of December, before anybody had asked, Patton had already given the order. He walked into the operations tent of the 3rd Army at his headquarters and he told Brigadier General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, and Colonel Halley Maddox, 47, his operations officer, to stop what they were doing and plan the opposite war. Break 3rd Army off its current offensive to the east. Wheel it 90 degrees drive north into Luxembourg. He did not want one plan. He wanted 3, one for each possible axis of advance, each one with the march tables already written, each one with the road priorities already established, each one with a code word. By the time the sun came up on the 19th, all 3 plans existed on paper. That afternoon at Verdun, Eisenhower called his commanders together. Bradley was there. He had heard from Patton the night before. He was not surprised. Everyone else in that room was surprised. Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The senior officers in that room did not believe it was physically possible. Eisenhower said, "Take 3 days instead of doing it piecemeal." Patton walked over to the field telephone. He spoke one prearranged phrase into it. One phrase and an army began to move. No new orders were written, no conference was held, the staff work had been finished 36 hours earlier. What happened next was the largest and fastest military redeployment of the war in Europe. More than 133,000 vehicles rerouted. 63,000 tons of supplies shifted in 5 days. 57 tons of maps delivered to units that had been fighting on completely different maps that same morning. Around 32,000 kilometers of signal wire laid. When the attack finally jumped off, 108 artillery battalions, 1,296 guns stood behind it. Patton spent those days riding around in an open jeep in below-zero cold, doing his own traffic control at frozen intersections, pushing stalled trucks with the drivers who had stalled them. By the 22nd of December, elements of 3rd Army were engaged with the German southern flank. By the 23rd, the sky cleared and the P-47 Thunderbolts came out. Part 3, the story of that sky clearing was already prepared. According to the post-war memoir of Colonel James H. O'Neill, 55 years old, senior Catholic chaplain of 3rd Army, Patton had summoned him to headquarters on the 8th of December 1944, 8 days before the German offensive. Patton had asked him for a prayer. Not for the wounded, not for the dead, for the weather. O'Neill had gone back to his office and had written a single-page prayer, short, direct, asking God for good weather so that American aircraft could support American troops in contact. 250,000 copies had been printed. They had been distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army. On the 23rd of December, the sky over the Ardennes broke open. The Thunderbolts came out of the clouds and they began to hunt German columns on frozen roads. Patton pinned a bronze star on O'Neill's chest and told him his prayer had worked. Whether God was involved is not something the historical record can settle. What the historical record can settle is this, that George Patton, in early December of 1944, before there was any operational reason to think he would need better weather, had asked his chaplain to prepare a prayer for it. He had prepared before there was anything to prepare for. Inside Bastogne itself, on the 22nd of December, a German delegation had come forward under a white flag to demand the surrender of the American garrison. The acting commander of the 101st Airborne was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, 46 years old, artillerist officer, quiet man, not famous outside the airborne community. He read the surrender demand, he wrote his answer on the paper. One word, nuts. His staff officer had to explain to the German delegation what it meant. He told them more or less that it meant go to hell. The German attack against the town resumed at 6 the next morning. The 4th Armored Division was fighting its way north over ground it had never seen before, roughly 100 miles from where it had started the week before. Every road iced, every ridge held, every village a fight. Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, 30 years old, tank officer from Massachusetts. A man who would later, 23 years down the road, command all American ground forces in Vietnam and end his life as Chief of Staff of the Army. On that afternoon in December of 1944, he was 30. He was commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, and he was 3 miles south of a village called Assenois. And Assenois was the last German position between his tanks and the perimeter of Bastogne. Late in the afternoon of the 26th of December, Abrams ordered his tanks to attack straight down the road into Assenois. Behind them, 2,340 rounds of American artillery fire came down onto the village in a matter of minutes. The tanks drove through their own barrage. Around 4:50 in the afternoon, the lead tank cleared the last German position south of Bastogne. It was a Sherman heavier than the standard model sloped extra armor welded to the front. Its name stenciled on the front glacis was Cobra King. Its commander was First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, 27 years old, Illinois farm kid before the war. He rolled forward alone into the open ground south of the town. He saw figures rising up out of foxholes at the edge of a wood line ahead of him. They were dug in on the American perimeter. He shouted from the turret, "Come out, this is the 4th Armored." The man who came out of the closest foxhole was a lieutenant of the 326th Airborne Engineers named Dwayne Webster. The corridor into Bastogne was open. It had not been cheap. The 4th Armored had lost close to 1,000 men reaching it. Abrams's own tank battalion was down to about 20 operational tanks. His lead company was down to 4. 3rd Army as a whole, in the Ardennes, would take 41,315 casualties in December of 1944 and January 1945. That was the price in blood for the 90-degree wheel. That was the cost of an army that had prepared before there was anything to prepare for. Patton called the relief of Bastogne the outstanding achievement of the war. He was proud of it in a way. He was proud of nothing else he had done. He had reason to be. After the war, when the German staff officers were interrogated, and when they wrote their memoirs, they wrote about it. Lieutenant General Gunther Blumentritt, 51, who had served as Chief of Staff for the German Army in the West, wrote that they had considered Patton the most aggressive panzer general on the Allied side, a man of thunderous action. He wrote that Patton's campaigns had come closer to the German idea of a commander than any other Allied officers had come. General Alfred Jodl, 54, chief of the operations staff for the German High Command, was blunter. He called Patton the American Guderian, a general who loved big movements, who took giant risks, and who won giant successes. Rommel himself, before he died in October of 1944, had written in his private notes that Patton's army in France had produced the most spectacular achievements of mobile warfare he had ever seen. Rommel, who had left North Africa believing the Americans could not fight, had lived long enough to change his mind about one American. By name, the German army had spent 2.5 years being told that Americans could not fight. It had spent those same 2.5 years learning the name of the one American who could not be stopped from moving. 3 moves: El Guettar, Palermo, and Messina Bastogne. 3 times Patton had the plan finished before anybody gave the order. 3 times he moved faster than the Germans believed possible. 3 times the blow landed at the exact place the enemy had already decided no blow could reach. That was not luck. That was not genius either. Not really. That was a philosophy. And that is why, 80 years later, in staff colleges and armor schools all over the United States, they are still teaching what George Patton did. Not because he was a great man. He was not always a great man. He slapped soldiers in a hospital in Sicily and almost ended his career for it. He drove his men through the Ardennes at a cost of 41,000 casualties. He said things after the war ended that got him relieved of his own army. He died on the 21st of December 1945 in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, 12 days after his staff car had been hit by an army truck at a low-speed intersection in Mannheim. His neck broken awake, speaking, angry at the way of it. He was buried at the American cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, among the dead of his own Third Army, the general and the men he had spent to buy the road to Bastogne. Together, under identical white crosses, he was 60 years old. They are still teaching what he did because he understood something that many good generals never understand. In mechanized war, speed is not a tactic, speed is the strategy itself. The general who moves first wins. And in the 28 months between March of 1943 and May of 1945, in a valley in Tunisia, on a coastal road in Sicily, and in the frozen wheel toward Bastogne, one American general moved first 3 times against the best army in the world. And each time he arrived before the enemy believed he could.